Good morning, everybody. How are you today? Well, I like that. My name is Steve Abed. I'm the department head of the Social Sciences Department here at Grand Rapids Community College, and I am able to be with you today because we have an excellent slate of speakers and conversation topics to talk with you about, and so I'm glad that so many of you were able to be here, and hopefully not only will you get a lot out of this morning's talk, but you'll share the information with friends and classmates and so on that this is going on, and maybe you can return for some of the other events and help us to celebrate this inaugural Gender and Sexuality Symposium. One of the things that you hopefully received on your way in was a sheet like this that is an evaluation sheet. We like to sort of keep track of what's happening and what our perceptions that people have when they attend these. So if you did not get one, make sure you let us know and we'll try to get you one right away, and then you can sort of keep track as we go along with the conversation today. I want to get right into it. So today we have with us one of our members of the department from Social Sciences, history professor Mike Light. And Mike Light attended Black Hawk Community College in Iowa, where he received an Associates of Arts degree. He went on to Illinois State University, where he had a BA in history and also an MA in history with an emphasis on immigration and ethnic studies. His master's thesis was titled Swedish Immigration to Rock Island County, Illinois. From there, he traveled to Northern Illinois University, where he began PhD work in U.S. history and immigration and ethnic studies with a focus on Hispanic immigration and community formation in the Midwest. He's an active member of local history boards, including board membership on the Grand Rapids Historical Commission and the Grand Rapids Historical Society. At Grand Rapids Community College, he's also a member of the Academic Governing Council and the Academic Governing Council Executive Committee, so he's been very, very active. He was a member of the Provost Search Committee and actually co-chaired that committee, and currently is serving on the steering committee for the presidential investiture ceremonies, which will take place next week. So we have a very active member of our faculty and also an active historian to be with us today. He's been teaching here at Grand Rapids Community College for 10 years, teaching U.S. history as well as U.S. history, immigration, and ethnicity, as well as African American history. So I'm very, very pleased and honored to be able to introduce to you Professor Mike Light, who will be speaking on the topic, Not Born, but Becoming. Thank you.
All right, thanks to Professor Abed for that very nice introduction. I didn't realize I was so busy until I started ticking off all those things. So I'm happy to be here. I'm particularly pleased that my colleagues, Professor Susan Williams and Professor Robert Hendershot, asked me to participate in this because gender studies are not my area of focus. So that was not listed on any of the things that Professor Abed mentioned about my background. So I'm playing in someone else's sandbox today. And I'm happy to be able to do so because one of the things that has interested me for a long time is identity formation and social constructs around race and ethnicity. And one of the things that is important and is probably a lesson for me, and I hope a lesson that you take away as well, and I'll try to focus on this throughout, is that issues like race and gender and social class are not independent factors. They don't stand alone. They're impacted by each other and often very fluid and changing depending on historical circumstances. And that's where I draw the title for my presentation today. Not Born but Becoming is a quote from Simone de Beauvoir from The Second Sex, a famous feminist tract. The idea being, from my interpretation anyway, that people are not born into any specific gender identities. It's something that's constructed, changes as they navigate through life, and I think from her perspective, something that can often be projected onto a person rather than something that's self-created all the time. So there's a delicate interplay there. And I think that's, to a great degree, how I view the formation of what we call America. I ask most of my students at some point or another during the semester, what does it mean to be an American? And, it seems simple. It could be very trite. It could be mom, baseball, apple pie, that kind of stuff. But it's actually much more complicated than that. And if you've never thought about it, I would encourage you to do so, because that's a window into the type of concept that would lead to a symposium like we have today. What it means to be an American changes from time to time, from place to place, and from person to person. And I would gather if you really sat down and tried to think about it in a deep and logical way, it's difficult to come up with a definition of what it means to be American. We all live under one constitution, and as far as I'm concerned, that may be the extent of it. Culture is different, gender expectations are different, race, ethnicity, religion, social class, all these things change. So, in this instance, with respect to colonial America, what I hope to do and what I set out to do is to try to talk about how Americans began that process of defining what it meant to be an American using gender as a lens. Okay, now I won't just talk about gender, but that will be the focus. These are the topics that I'm going to focus on. Some of these to a greater degree than others, but I want to talk about the beginnings of the confusion that surround gender ideology and gender identity in the British colonies in North America. We're going to talk about British colonialism in particular. There's a lot that we could do in terms of Spanish colonies or the French colonies. If you attended Professor Hendershot's lecture this morning, he did a fantastic job with focusing on gender from a Native American perspective, especially pre-contact Native American perspective. And in trying to talk about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about Queen Elizabeth, a lot about Pocahontas, and I probably am going to need your help in this respect when we talk about Pocahontas, because there's a lot of myth that doesn't have much to do with reality when it comes to that kind of story, and it's a perfect lens through which to view this contested image of gender. And I'm also going to talk about something that I think is important, which is not something that I'll just be really honest with you, not something that I thought I would discover as I set out down this trail, that when some of our founding fathers began to define what it meant to be an American, they did this in distinctly gender-specific ways. And one of the things that I find really fascinating is that people like Thomas Jefferson would refer to America in a masculine sense, and especially in opposition to the others that were encountered in North America, in particular Native Americans and African slaves, but also, really interestingly, with respect to, or in opposition to, other European nations like the French. And Jefferson is a Francophile. He's somebody who respected the French, believed in the French Revolution, but somehow thinks that they've lost their way. Or maybe, more importantly, not quite evolved to the point that Americans had during the later life of Jefferson. So I think that's a very interesting concept that I want to spend some time talking with you about. And then I'm going to show you a case study, which I think is really interesting. One of the most aggressively documented early instances of abortion in colonial America, and what I call sort of patriarchy on trial, this whole concept of men ruling the household, men ruling the economy, and men ruling sexuality all play out in this one particular abortion case in New England. And I'll show you the website if you're interested in this. It's something that's readily available to students, all the documents collected in one place. It's a fantastic opportunity, so I wanted to share that with you. Now, in terms of defining what race, class, and gender mean, our focus today is on gender. I mentioned to you they're intimately related. They can be seen as overlapping rather than as independent variables. The focal point for me, or sort of the lens through which I'm going to view this, the best work on this topic for colonial America comes from Kathleen Brown, and it's titled Good Wives, Nasty Wenches, and Anxious Patriarchs, which is a fantastic title. Published in 1996 by the University of North Carolina Press. So much of my theoretical framework comes from her ideas, not exclusively, but especially in terms of how she thinks about the interplay between these concepts. A lot of people have written about gender in colonial America, far more than we could talk about today. But very few people have tried to tackle that interaction between race, gender, and class in the way that Kathleen Brown does. So if you're interested in this topic, I think she is the one person that I would recommend you pick up her book and read. The Oxford English Dictionary defining gender talks about gender as the fact of being male or female. If you've attended any of the lessons, any of the lectures or paper presentations for the symposium either yesterday or this morning, you know that it's far more complicated than that. When historians think about this, they think about it as something that's changing. So I'll use Kathleen Brown's definition, which I think is really good. Gender is contested and changing. Historically specific discourses, social roles, and identities defining sexual difference and frequently deployed for the purposes of social and political order. So what she's talking about is historically specific discourses. The time, the place, the context in which you talk about gender matters. It changes all the time. There's this concept that I think is out there that history never changes, right? That once you know the past, you know it, and it's an unchanging story. That's a bunch of rubbish. It changes all the time, and we're constantly reevaluating how people experienced the particular moment in time in which they lived. And Kathleen Brown, as I mentioned, is a great resource for us. So gender, really, from my perspective, the thing that interested me the most is it can be used to talk about things like power and control, how human beings create identity, how communities create identity, and then hopefully how a nation begins to create an identity, and that will be our focus. All right, we start off with Queen Elizabeth. Most of you probably know this, some of you may not, that the story of America, what America means, begins with a woman. Queen Elizabeth is able to accomplish things that Henry VIII, her father, never really dreamed of in terms of realizing some of his agenda and his goals, and one of those is building colonies in North America. She's highly successful, but because she is a female, she's also controversial. She's controversial during her day, and I think she's remembered in a uniquely, a sort of a distinctive fashion from an American perspective and from a British perspective as well. She never married, right? She's part of a patrilineal system, a patriarchal system in European society where wealth and power and prestige is passed on from father to son. So because she never marries, which is a political decision that she makes, and a rather crafty one at that, if she were to get married, she'd have to hand off most of her power to the man in her life. She's referred to as the Virgin Queen. Now, I would posit to you that probably she's not really technically a virgin in the way we might think of it today, but the idea that she was wed to the British people. She actually comes out and makes a big speech where she says, "I'm married to the British cause," and they ate that up. They just love that, right? They still think about that today. But because this is the woman who begins the colonial experiment in America, some of that concept of empire gets a gender, it's brushed with a gender paintbrush, if you will. It becomes more female than it might have been if this was a male monarch that had engaged in the same process. And many writers will talk about that during this particular time period. I've got a couple examples. George Chapman, who with a group of other men wrote a book called Eastward Ho. There's a long, really interesting history about this particular text that I won't necessarily get into today, but it's a response to other works that have been published in England prior to this. Will refer to the American imperial experiment, especially in North America, as a virgin wilderness. That the North American landscape is waiting for England to occupy, to take over, to penetrate, if you will. So this highly sexualized image of Virginia and British colonial North America becomes ingrained in the popular culture. William Strachey is another one who writes about this book called The History of Travel into Virginia, Britannia. All this published in the early 1600s. And so you're going to see this over and over and over again in British culture, referring to gender in the colonial context. Now, if you think back to what I said before, something's going to happen where by the time you get to Thomas Jefferson in America, that all of a sudden America is going to be defined as masculine. But when it started, it was almost always described as feminine, right? This particular idea. There's a lot of myth to that as well. Part of it is if it's a virgin landscape, you would expect it to be uninhabited, not used properly by the inhabitants that live there. So there's a lot of negative assumptions about Native Americans wrapped up in these ideas as well. One way to depict this is to think about some of the early images of America, Columbia as freedom, Native American virgin images. If America is a virgin landscape and a virgin wilderness, then maybe the inhabitants also adopt that particular gender aspect, that particular gender role. It's very interesting that because Native Americans live in such balance with their natural surroundings, they're viewed as one with the wilderness. And so if the wilderness is a virgin context, then maybe these Native Americans are also virgin as well. They become female in a really distinct way. You can see this in this image. Lots of ways to talk about the differences between European and Native American cultures on the eve of contact. And in this case, we're looking at Native American engendered lifeways from a European perspective. And again, the whole focus of this is that Native Americans will be given, from a European perspective, especially a British perspective, a female connotation. All Native Americans, regardless of their gender, male or female, are described in feminine terms. Okay, so they have an image that's being projected onto them. Europeans, the English in particular, will describe what they're doing in very masculine terms. Okay, so there's a relationship that's genderized and sexualized here. I want to talk about all three of these in some detail, but I thought it might help me as well as you to put this out in sort of a grid. A lot of this stems from discussions about the cultural differences that existed between these two groups, and I mentioned that people like Kathleen Brown will talk about this interplay between gender, race and ethnicity, religion, social class. Native Americans were polytheistic for the most part, which means that they believed in many gods. Polytheism, many deities. Europeans come from a distinctly Christian background, monotheistic. That Christian background is also, to a certain degree, divorced from the natural environment. When Europeans look at Native American religious worship, one of the things that they think about is how infused and connected to nature these Native American religious practices are. So who are the many gods that Native Americans have? Well, gods that are place-specific, that allow them to survive, to gain calories, to build a community. So it would be those natural phenomenon that give life. Religion intimately connected to life-giving. From a Native American perspective, when an ancestor dies, and of course we're making generalizations here, there are always exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, if a Native American dies, their spirit does not flee this world. It does not go to some otherworldly place. It doesn't go to a heaven. It goes back into the environment. So you can imagine how powerful that would be for modern religious practitioners, whether they be Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, who try to exhort their followers to think about faith on a regular basis. Native Americans walked it, lived it, breathed it. It was all around them. And I think that that's a really powerful difference. So that connection to the natural world is something that's very distinct from Christianity. Now, I'm not saying that Christianity and Christians never thought about nature. That's not the case at all. But they are sort of separated from it in a way that Native Americans are not. This causes all kinds of complications, right? Many, many complications, because at the heart of this is a competition between these two groups of people over resources, over land. For Native Americans, the land is not just about giving life and producing calories, but it's also about their culture, it's about their faith, it's about their religion. So Professor Hendershot this morning did a fantastic job discussing what happens when Native Americans are displaced from their particular region and forced onto reservations, that it's a destruction not only of their land and their economy, but also their faith and their culture. So it's a very important aspect to this. Europeans are, in a sense, free to be colonizers because they have sort of divorced themselves from the natural world. Christianity, anybody can become a Christian. It's universally applicable. All you have to do is expose them to it, in some cases maybe force them to it. There's also a belief that much of what Native Americans do, because it's so difficult for Europeans to understand, is linked to witchcraft. It's linked to Satan, that Satan has influenced or impacted Native American belief systems in a way that Christians must work hard to overcome. And we'll talk about many examples and many instances where Europeans actually speak directly to this. They also, of course, as I've already mentioned, infuse this with sexuality, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. None of these, again, are independent variables. So if you move into this category of land and land usage, females in Native American communities play a distinct role in agriculture that is going to be different than what Americans will try to accomplish in terms of gender relationships as they move through the colonial era and into the Revolutionary era. Men are warriors, they're hunters, they kill, they take life. Women, however, are nurturers. They raise the crops, they gather the crops, they raise the children. And there's a really powerful spiritual connection there for these Native American men and women, that women are life givers. And the cycle of a plant, if you're an agricultural community, is the same as the life cycle for a human being. And that's a very gender specific. It makes perfect sense to Native Americans that women would be engaged in this because they're the ones that give life and provide life. So why wouldn't they do it in this other way? In the European system, you've got private ownership of land, a patrilineal descent system that passes on wealth from father to son, and a patriarchal notion that's constantly in evolution that allows men to be the ones in control of the economy, the household, and female sexuality. Contrast that with Native Americans who live a communal lifestyle, a balanced lifestyle, seeking balance in what they try to accomplish, with a male-dominated system. And you can start to see the recipe for disaster. From a political perspective, women have a variety of roles in Native American communities that are not as rigid as they would be in a European context. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is the role of the female Native American as a political mediator, as a diplomat, if you will. Women used in political instances to conduct diplomacy, to be a bridge between cultures. If you go back and read the works of early Americans, colonial Americans, they will talk frequently about these people who were in between peoples that could cross cultural boundaries. Most of the time on the European side, on the English side in particular, these were always men. They could be men who were really adept at language instruction. They were fantastic as negotiators between these two cultures. They adopted some of the Native American cultural concepts, and they were accepted by Native Americans to a certain degree. But when they talk about Native Americans and who were those people that they met in the middle, they're often women. And I find that to be fascinating. And that's a challenge to the kinds of political structures that Europeans expect. So as Queen Elizabeth was an irregular monarch from a European perspective because she is female, she's not male, this is an irregular attitude, an irregular position for Native American women to occupy. So we'll get into that as well. And again, all this leads to Englishmen starting to talk about Native American culture in whole, in total, as female in nature. There's a lot of evidence from many different sources about why Native Americans, if they're being categorized as feminine and female as a whole, why there's this link with satanic worship. You know, part of it is just cultural misunderstanding, right? It's difficult for Europeans to be able to understand what it is that Native American religious practices hope to accomplish. But also part of it is the role that women play in these societies. Women were viewed as the weaker sex from an English perspective. As the weaker sex, they were more susceptible to Satan's work. Satan could enter their lives, could control them to a greater degree than they could control men. Doesn't mean that men were never defined as witches or satanic. That happened a lot. But in the vast majority of cases, people that are accused of being witches are female, and it's because of these earlier concepts. So here you see some very prominent colonial images of satanic witchcraft, always women. Of course, here they're looking for the witch's mark. And these women are often the ones that are accused of being witches. The arresting of a witch, from the Salem environment, soul-killing witches that deform the body, almost always women in these instances. In order to control women's weaker bodies and their constitutions, you needed to have special punishments that would cleanse women. So one of the punishments for a woman who stepped out of her place in any way, shape, or form was this method called ducking, which you see indicated here very clearly, this whole idea of cleansing and washing, and you can read into that a lot of biblical connotations, baptism, all those things are there. But this is something that was practiced in Europe and would be done in colonial America as well. The witch's scold or the witch's bridle, if you look at these hellacious contraptions here, meant to control the ability of women to speak, to publicly pronounce. That's a really impressive part of this, that these women are possessed and behaving in a manner that is not appropriate for a female, that somehow this is Satan's evidence of Satan's handiwork, and therefore you need to put them in these contraptions to be able to control their ability to speak. If you take away someone's voice, you take away a bit of their humanity, maybe most of their humanity in some instance. So this is a way for men to control women, although this wouldn't have been applied just to women. I have a quote down here. I don't know if you can see it very easily. John Cotton is a famous Puritan minister, and he preached constantly about this concept, which would be very common back in Europe, that women's bodies were weak and could not fight off satanic attacks. So this whole idea of the female body and the spirit as equal to sinfulness and corruption, can you imagine what would happen in the minds of Englishmen if you take this and then apply it to all Native American people, regardless of gender, biological gender? The body is weak. Women in particular are weaker than men. This is how Elizabeth Reese in the Journal of American History talked about this particular aspect in colonial America. Women's more fragile bodies also expose them to Satan, perhaps encouraging a peculiar potential for evil. Eve's legacy. In the context of the witchcraft outbreaks, a time of extraordinary uncertainty and fear, New Englanders focused on the darker side of womanhood, emphasizing the vulnerability of women's bodies and souls to the devil rather than their openness to regeneration. Women as witches were so threatening because their souls had made a conscious decision to ally with Satan. Too impatient or too weak to wait passively for Christ's advance, witches allowed their bodies and souls to choose actively the seductions of the devil. Take this, apply it to Native Americans, you start to see some of the same language coming up. Reverend Alexander Whitaker, Colonial America. All these things make me think that there be great witches among them and that they are very familiar with the devil. It's referencing Native American peoples along the east coast of the United States and their Native American religious practices. Witches. Men or women, witches. The English would do well to recover out of the arms of the devil Native peoples. Satan has been allowed to sort of run amok in Native American communities, and their religious practices are examples of that. John Rolfe, do you guys know who John Rolfe was? Or do you know that name? Go ahead. Yeah, he's the guy who would marry Pocahontas, and we're going to talk about Pocahontas for quite a bit. He has a particularly interesting story about this because he does marry a Native American woman, and he feels tremendous amounts of guilt and shame for doing so, but being attracted to this Native American woman, he believes is somehow an indication of his own weakness, that he's been tempted by Satan. It's a really powerful story that we'll talk about in detail a little bit later. I mentioned the role of Native American women in agricultural production. From an English perspective, the failure, and this is a failure in almost all the instances that they describe this, the failure of Native American men to engage in cultivation is a sign of their weakness, a sign that women have too much control. If women have too much control, by design, Satan would have too much control over the activities of these Native American people. They're starting to come up with this concept that because Native American men have failed to dominate the land and the natural environment, that the land, from a Native American perspective, is without value. In other words, easily taken, easily used. Who better to teach Native Americans the proper use of land and resources than Europeans who do this the right way? That's the concept. So in this image, you see the extent of what many eastern woodlands Native American communities would have allowed men to do, which would be the hoeing of the fields, and then the women would do the cultivating. They would sow the seeds, they would raise the crops, they would harvest the crops. That was part of the life cycle for women. You can also see, and there are thousands of these sorts of images, examples of first contact between Europeans and Native Americans. Now, this is a French reproduction. But one of the things that you see over and over again, and if we had time, we could go through dozens of these today, is that when artists, engravers, will represent what Native American culture was like on the eve of contact, they will take gender out of the picture because it's too fluid. They don't know how to describe it initially. So this is early contact. This is an image from the 1500s, the French encountering Native Americans in Florida. And what you see here are a group of Native Americans. I would argue you cannot find a Native American female or a child in that image. And all of the men look basically the same. Now, there's a lot going on here. There are a lot of expectations in this image, expectations about what Europeans hope to accomplish and what Native Americans hope to accomplish in terms of this relationship, meeting this new group of people. But from a European perspective, these Frenchmen are engaged in a classic military maneuver here. Their ships are turned toward the shore, right? The sides of the ships, because of the cannonade on each side of the ship to provide cover, if need be, to attack these Native Americans. They're engaged in a flanking operation to surround this group of Native Americans, treating them as a military threat initially. And then Native Americans are engaged in all sorts of different reactions to this European intrusion, from debate with what we might expect would be the depiction of a tribal council, to some Native Americans picking up weaponry, to others hoping to engage in trade. And since this is a French image, you would expect nothing less than to see some Native American animal pelts and animal skins prominently displayed in the image. The background here also, I think, is an indicator of the confusion surrounding gender and how gender can sometimes be projected onto a group of people despite the reality of what might actually be occurring. This is a very cultivated landscape. Forests don't grow like this. So when an artist or an engraver would have gone back and made an image like this, one of the things that would have happened is they would have based this off of the accounts of the Frenchmen, in this instance, who actually encountered these Native Americans the first time. So you're seeing this through European eyes. And I think the fact that gender is not depicted is a pretty fascinating, at least female gender. Young people not depicted in the image is a really powerful statement about the confusion surrounding how you would depict these individuals. There's also a lot of contempt in these images. Again, this is a French image. I don't know what it means that I keep picking out French images, but maybe there's more of this contempt in there. I'm of French background, so I can throw that out there. But here you see a group of French military men encountering a group of Native Americans, and there's trade being conducted. In this case, you do see men and women in the image, although far more men than women, including one fantastically large Native American male who we could assume the French imagined to be the chief or the principal leader of this Native American group, sort of beckoning these Europeans into a trade relationship. The articles of trade are all laid out here on the ground. What I would pose to you is that most of these articles of trade are women's work. Crops, harvested, grown, wild grains gathered, wild berries gathered. Most of this is women's work being exchanged for a European trade good. Now, Europeans in this instance aren't offering much of anything in return. What do you see that might be of European origin? What are they offering? In a sense, Native Americans are offering the ability to survive in this environment. Much of that would come from women's work. What are the Europeans offering? Go ahead.
Yeah, metal pots.
Yeah, we've got a couple sorry metal pots down here, right, which is an indicator of the metalworking of Europeans that Native Americans would greatly desire, especially their weaponry, maybe more than their pots. What is this? Go ahead.
Like faith, religion, Christianity.
Are you speaking about this thing here?
I don't know what that means. I'm just assuming
Well, why did you say faith, religion, Christianity?
because that's what they usually generally grow with them.
Tell me what you see here, though. I don't think that you're wrong necessarily, but tell me how you see that in the image. Alex.
The symbol, the seal that they have, the Saint marking, yeah, that.
What is that?
It's a French symbol
It's royalty, right? It's a crest. It's a royal crest. So if you think about what Europeans are offering here, why is it affixed to this thing? Do you think that, what is this? What is this? It's a column, right? Do you think Europeans actually threw columns, marble columns onto their ships and hauled them across the Atlantic? This is supposed to be symbolic of something else. What is it symbolic of? Strength, power, civilization, right? Europeans are offering civilization as their trademark. This is what they're going to give to Native Americans. Unfortunately, I think if you look, the look on this guy's face reminds me constantly of the look on my students' faces when I'm in class, right? So I know contempt or indifference when I see it. This is a classic example of that, right? He's not interested in what these Native Americans have to offer. He's interested in what the Frenchmen are offering to Native Americans. And you're going to see this concept over and over and over again, that whatever the European colonizers do to these people, whether they be natives or they be African slaves later on, they do in the best interests of these people, right? That they're doing it for their own good. In this case, bringing them civilization. You can imagine this isn't going to last much longer, right? These things are not as important to the Frenchmen as this. And of course, how are they depicting the Native Americans reacting? Yeah, falling down on their knees, worshiping this column, right? You can imagine this, the likelihood of this actually happening. All right. One of the other aspects of this related to the inability of Native American men to cultivate is that Native American men are almost always associated with hunting. And this practice in the minds of many Englishmen becomes evidence of their sort of equating them with the beasts of the forest and the fields, that they are no better than animals. They're not truly men. Here you see some classic examples. Do you know who this is? It's not John Rolfe, but it's Captain John Smith, apprehending a Native American, treating him like an animal in what respect? Grabbing him by the mane, right? If you think of horse culture, a symbol of dominance. You also have Native Americans in the background. You have Englishmen attacking these Native Americans in the background. And look at how the Native Americans have lined up. What does that remind you of? Formation of birds, a flock of birds. There's all this imagery associating Native American men in particular with animals. And the whole story here, this is a collection of images that was supposed to tell the story of John Smith's capture by Pocahontas' people and his eventual domination of those people. So you can see a lot of the same things going down here. He's actually apprehended another Native American down here, has him by the hair as well. Okay. So this lack of mastery over nature, equating Native American men to animals. Here's a quote from John Smith. "It's strange to see how their bodies alter with their diet. Even as the deer and the wild beasts, they seem fat and lean, strong and weak. Native American men are never constant. They're never in control, always in control. They're at the mercy of the natural forces in the world. They've not yet dominated nature." And so you'll see a lot of images of Native Americans in very animalistic forms. Of course, this weakness of the body, the altering of the body from strength to weakness, could also be a discussion of female reproductive processes as well. So a lot of scholars have looked at this as evidence of sort of trying to project a female gender through the weakness of the body onto Native American men. It's an interesting concept. Here you see another example, an engraving by the artist William Hull in 1612. The animal linked with the man. All of these examples of Native American male weakness. All right. Pocahontas, in particular, is a great story for this. You guys know the story of Pocahontas? You know this story, right? Right? Tell me about Pocahontas. Who was she? Who were these three characters here? Pocahontas, Captain John Smith, John Rolfe. They become sort of pop culture figures thanks to Walt Disney and others. Right? Tell me the story. What do you know?
The daughter of the chief.
All right, she's the daughter of a principal chief, right? You know what his name was? Powhatan? right? What's her role? What's the relationship between Pocahontas and John Smith? What happened? You guys do not watch Disney movies? Are you kidding me? How many of you have seen the Disney-fied version of Pocahontas? They fall in love, right? This is completely non-historical, correct? I mean, the whole idea behind the Disney-fied version of Pocahontas is to make you believe that it's possible for people to overcome great differences. So it's a great story to teach to children, right? That despite cultural differences and come from different parts of the world, you can still find love and happiness. But most of this is nonsense. The Pocahontas that you see here, despite the fact that this is a movie intended for young people, is a very sexualized version of Pocahontas. She's much older than the actual Pocahontas, who most historians believe was probably 10 years old when she first encountered Captain John Smith. That did not stop him from viewing her in a sexual light. We'll talk about that. He viewed all Native American women and most men in a sexualized fashion. He talked about them very distinctly as distinct sexual beings. This is a really great representation of this kind of sexualized Pocahontas. We have other versions that are not intended for children. How many of you saw this absolutely horrifically horrible movie, The New World? Any of you? Okay. Now, I was going to, but I don't think I will. I was going to show you the trailer for this, but I'll encourage you to go out and check out the trailer sometime for this movie. You know, Colin Farrell is Captain John Smith. He's this dashing figure who's trying to make his own destiny in the New World. And the men in this film, the European men in this film, are completely put together patrilineal, patriarchal figures. They are projecting an image back in time that did not necessarily exist. And again, Pocahontas is a much older woman. She's an object of sexual desire. And Native American religious practices, which the film spends a lot of time dealing with, are almost always depicted in a very satanic, sort of frenetic, chaotic manner. This entire idea of chaos being a part of what Native Americans were involved, very different from what we understand today as historians, that Native Americans actually tried to achieve this balance. From an English perspective, it seems chaotic. Okay? Here you see some of the images that have been depicted throughout time. You know, the story, the basic story of Pocahontas is that the Englishmen who arrived in Virginia in 1607 are there for a particular purpose. They're there for plunder. They're there to acquire land, to acquire gold, to acquire silver. They are the English version of the Spanish conquistador. Okay? They're soldiers of fortune. They're looking to make a fortune. They don't find gold and silver in Virginia, so they have to find some other means to make this colonial endeavor productive. One of the ways they're going to do that is through land acquisition. Eventually, it will be through the adoption of a tobacco agricultural system using indentured servants, and then eventually African slaves to be able to make the colony productive. But in the beginning, there's huge amounts of chaos and violence. The English are late arrivers in terms of colonization. It's interesting that they are the ones considered to have given birth to this country, yet they're one of the last European nations to arrive in terms of colonization. So these Native Americans, Pocahontas' people, would have already heard of and understood that other Europeans, the Dutch and the French in particular before, had cultivated trade relationships with Native American communities. The Englishmen didn't seem much interested in that. They're much more interested in domination. So why would we trade them guns and ammunition and horses when we need those things to be able to conquer these Native American people who possess the land that we desire? So one of the things that the Native Americans did is they oscillate between these amazingly generous gifts of food. The Native Americans know that these colonists are starving. It's actually a 3-year time period where the colonists in Jamestown refer to the period as the starving time. If they call it that, you can imagine how horrific it was. Evidences of cannibalism, extreme violence between the Englishmen living in the Jamestown colony. Luckily, that's not our Thanksgiving story, right? It would be a very different celebration that we'd have if we were celebrating Jamestown and not Plymouth. But in order to figure out these Europeans, in order to try to understand where they're coming from, the Native Americans will abduct John Smith. They put him on trial, which most historians believe was a typical form of political manipulation. Abduct your enemy, put them on trial, take them to the point of execution, and then let them go. The message being, don't mess with us, right? We could have killed you. We didn't. We expect better relations in the future. This is exactly what happens to John Smith. The role of Pocahontas is that she's inserted into this, and there's a lot of debate about whether this is deliberate or not, or what are the motivation for it. I think it's pretty clear. Native American women were often used as intermediaries. I've already discussed that. She is a perfectly functioning diplomat from a Native American perspective. So why does she save John Smith? Well, it would be by design then, right? She's to go back with these Englishmen. She's to figure out what their motivation is. Hopefully, to forge a new relationship. This relationship up to this point has been built on nothing but violence and mistrust. And so Pocahontas becomes a major figure of power within this community, but John Smith will never see that. He sees her in sort of a dual light, as an angel who came to save him, or as this sexualized being that he covets and desires, never as a diplomat, somebody who stands on her own, a woman with her own power. This is one example. Pocahontas is the Native American mediator. Here you see a much more sexualized image of Pocahontas saving John Smith, where he's actually nestled in between her breasts as the death blow is ready to be delivered. Here's a more accurate and a much later depiction of Pocahontas saving John Smith. In this one, she actually does look like a girl of 10 or 11 years old. Historians have said, why Pocahontas? From all we know, she was extremely aggressive and important in the community in terms of language initiation. She learned English quicker than almost anyone in her community, which made her a perfect person to send back with the English to try to communicate. If you watch The New World, it's ridiculous, right? There's this scene where Colin Farrell touches Pocahontas' lips. The first word he teaches her is lips in the film. If that doesn't say sexuality, I don't know what was. But Pocahontas is a child saving John Smith because she's deemed to be valuable. She's an important interpreter and an important mediator. Eventually, Pocahontas will marry an Englishman, in this case John Rolfe, who was a member of the Virginia colony. And Rolfe, as I mentioned, moves Pocahontas deliberately from a traditional image of the Native American princess to one of a fine, refined European woman. So this is a later image of Pocahontas, who will actually die in England, married to John Rolfe, and you see the transformation is complete. She's lost any aspect of her Native American background. She's become more like an English woman. Okay? As I mentioned, Rolfe is tortured by the idea that he's attracted to a Native American female. He can't seem to help himself. He can't stop himself. But one of the things he does is to sort of, diminish his guilt is to take her to London, to separate her from the natural world in which she grew up, and to turn her into an Englishwoman. Not for her own purposes, but really to sort of tamp down his guilt about being attracted to this Native American female. I mentioned John Smith constantly talking about Native Americans in a sexual way. There's something that I think is very fascinating about this. He's what I would consider to be the original American badass, and you'll forgive me for quoting Kid Rock or whatever. It's who I am. But the original American badass, he's John Wayne of earlier days, right? This is where the whole John Wayne image comes from. Every Native American woman that ever looks at him, when he writes about her as, desirable, desiring him. He's an object of desire. One of the first things that he talked about is that he was gifted with a dance by Native American virgins, decorated with red body paint, red dye. And little else, right? He's very graphic about his description, and how they took him into a longhouse and engaged in teasing and foreplay with him over and over again, to the point that it drove him mad. There's no evidence, and he doesn't talk about any of these relationships being consummated, but he's definitely titillated by that encounter, and that helps to solidify, I think, the way he'll think about Pocahontas later on. This promiscuity that Smith sees in Native American women, Native Americans would not have viewed that way, right? So this is one great example of that whole concept of an ideology or an image, a gender image in particular, being projected onto another group of people. So Smith is seeing sexual wantonness, he's seeing licentiousness. He's seeing sinfulness when he looks at these Native American women. And Native American women are seeing this in a very different light, which I want to talk about. And I think the key is the Pocahontas, the blood red dye that these Native American women use. Native Americans along the eastern seaboard used body paint and body decoration for a whole variety of cultural purposes. But for the most part, to wear the blood red dye, the Pocahontas, was a symbol of power. Warriors wore the blood red dye to battle. Here you see two great images of that, a much more modern image and a dated image. If women are allowed to wear the blood red dye, and there are 30 of these women dancing around Captain John Smith, from a Native American perspective, what do you think they imagine is happening? Englishmen, Frenchmen along the East Coast would write about Native American women being allowed to lie with them if they were visiting a Native American tribe, engaging in sexual activity. Many of the times, they talk about these women being freshly decorated with blood red dye, just like a warrior. What do you think Native American women, what role are they playing?
Warriors of the mind.
Warriors of the mind. Some historians have referred to it as sex as a weapon. Whatever it might be, maybe it's better to think of it as a diplomatic role. These women are playing a political role, trying to forge relationships with these newcomers in a way that makes sense to Native Americans, but is viewed by Europeans in a very different light. Okay, so to see a woman decorated like this, and I love this particular image because not only is she holding agricultural products, that whole idea of giving life, but she's decorated with the symbols of power. Okay, so female power wrapped up in a lot of these other concepts. So to wear that blood red dye in the way that a warrior would signifies that these women are engaged in some sort of important cultural contact with these outsiders. It's no small thing to allow someone to put that dye on. So when European men begin to encounter this, especially Englishmen, they misinterpret it. They don't see that, right? They project some other image onto these Native American women. All right. One of the things that begins to happen is that as Europeans become more successful in what they are trying to accomplish, they begin to create new identities in opposition to the Native Americans that they're encountering. So as Europeans take more land from Native Americans and destroy more Native American culture, and the population begins to increase, we'll talk about all these things, they begin to create a much more solidified version of what I would call American patriarchy, a distinct view of what it means to be a male in American society and all those things that come with it. And you begin to see it in the images that are being created in colonial America as well. There's the Edward Lloyd family by Charles Wilson Peele, a classic example of a sort of patriarchal image, the father, the white father standing over the mother and child. This one's particularly powerful because he's actually gazing at the audience, looking directly at you, rather than the women and the child who look off to the side. You don't see their gaze. You don't meet their gaze. So he's the one in control. He's the one in charge. He controls these people. They're part of him. You see it in many other ways as well, and I love some of these images because of the connotations of race and gender and class. This is George Washington with his slaves. You can see the fatherly figure imparting order and organization to a whole group of people, white and black, male and female. And in this instance, the white children, both male and female, are not allowed to sully themselves in the field. They're not actually engaging in the work of the field. This is an idealized image, right? You can't do this if you live in a frontier. So early in colonial America, you can't have a society where women and children are not engaged in the productive labor of creating a farm or a home. It has to happen. Only when time goes on and the situation begins to change through a whole host of factors do you begin to come to a realization that only certain groups of people are supposed to engage in a certain kind of work, and gender is often the lens that they use to talk about this, although race and class are as well. Here you see a very similar image William Penn engaging in treaty making with the Native Americans in Pennsylvania. Of course, Father Penn imparting his knowledge and his wisdom, his hands outstretched to all these other groups of people, including, very prominently displayed, which is unusual in some of these early contact images, Native American women and children. William Penn, again, Native Americans, of course, in the background. He is the important figure in this image. They are his children, so being sort of objectified in that way, he controls them. The planter on a tobacco plantation, his slaves laboring in the field, again, imparting organization, knowledge, power, all coming from the master of the plantation, the white father. So you see this over and over and over again in image after image. Alan Kulikoff, who wrote one of the best books on Virginia tobacco plantations called Tobacco and Slaves, describes a formula for the creation of this American domestic patriarchy. These are the criteria that have to be met, right? As I mentioned, you can't do this earlier on in the colonial experiment. There's too much chaos. You need women to be able to perform work in the fields. But eventually, once these things start to occur, then gender expectations begin to change as well. First of all, the destruction of the Native American culture. Okay, you have to get rid of that Native American culture. But as you're competing with that Native American culture, you're constantly evaluating yourself and how your life should be ordered in opposition to those Native Americans. A shift from indentured servitude to race-based slavery. You have to take out the aspect of the white woman working in the fields. You have to get this, if a female is allowed to work in the field, she has to be less than white. So a black female working in the fields is acceptable. A white female working in the fields is not acceptable. So they're starting to build a brand new identity, a new way of thinking about how life should be ordered. An increasing life expectancy. Men and women are living longer as the colonial period goes on. Increased population of European females in the colonies. Originally, very few white females traveled to colonial North America, to the British colonies. Later on, this increases. And an increasing overall population, a reduction of available land, means land is being controlled and dominated in the hands of fewer and fewer individuals. So in Virginia in particular, all of these things are occurring on the eve of the American Revolution. All these things have occurred. So the result, greater economic control for men in the dual spaces of home and business. Men control women, children, and dependent workers. Men control wealth, women, sexuality. Poor and the landless are often equated to Native Americans or slaves as being lesser, less civilized, less human, and in some ways emasculated, female, and weak. Okay? Even small yeoman farmers, according to Alan Kulikoff, learned the habit of deference in their own families. They're starting to learn that there's this new criteria, this new organization, hierarchical organization, and therefore understood the superior place of gentlemen in the political order. So even class becomes more important as time goes on. The more land you own, the more dependent laborers you have, the more masculine you are. Okay, that's the reality of what they're creating. This is where somebody like Jefferson comes into the story. Thomas Jefferson is an interesting character in a lot of ways. One of the things that makes him interesting is because there's this huge debate among biographers about Jefferson's attitude toward women and toward gender relationships. I've given you three of the most prominent from, I think, three distinct frames of mind about Jefferson. Kenneth Lockridge talks about the patriarchal rage theory according to Jefferson. So what he sees is Jefferson as a hater of women. He hates what he sees as weakness in women, and this stems from the fact that his father died when he was very young. His mother was in control of Jefferson's political fortunes and his economic legacy, and Jefferson always despised that. So Lockridge goes through an exhaustive study of Jefferson's own letters and his writings, and when he talked about and referred to his mother, that he believes there's a great amount of disdain and hate involved in that relationship. He despised his mother because of that control she had over him. In a way, emasculating him, right? He's only after she dies that he's able to be fully male, okay? The control of his mother. Winthrop Jordan writes about Jefferson, the woman hater. He believes that Jefferson was never comfortable in the presence of any woman. He talks about this as part of the reason why Jefferson sought solace with female slaves. It's because it was easier for him to control these women than it was white women in his life, who he was always very uncomfortable with. Winthrop Jordan has been criticized greatly about this because he's, rather than using a lot of original sources, he's sort of projecting from a lot of secondary sources. Lawrence Klein talks about Jefferson as being a much more nuanced individual when it comes to gender and the role of women in colonial American society, that women were fine in their proper place. He actually believes that, using Jefferson's wife as an example, that Jefferson was allowing women, encouraging women to become educated, part of the salon image of the French educated woman in Europe, but they could not step outside of that bounds. It was okay for a woman to be witty and educated behind closed doors, but certainly no control publicly or socially, so he shied away from women who had strong public voices. All these things are very interesting because Jefferson, probably more than any other writer, talks about America in a genderized fashion. He refers to the American society, American culture, as male in its formation. So a lot of this will influence the way he talks about it. The evidence for this comes from his great work, his notes on the state of Virginia, which a lot of people know because of its overtly racist statements about African Americans and Native Americans in particular. You know, Jefferson had this belief that Native Americans were simply misguided, if you want to think about it in terms of what we talked about earlier, been, dominated by Satan, but could be redeemable. African Americans, in his estimation, Africans were not redeemable. They could never achieve the same sorts of things as Native Americans. So this is one of the reasons why Jefferson would support, for example, something like the boarding school movement, which appears in American history much later on, where you try to erase everything that's native about the Native American male, and then what you have, or the female, and what you have left over is a person that you can form in your own image. That kind of thing is never going to be extended to Africans. But he talks about the savage versus the civilized. And I think this is his major framework when it comes to gender in America. North America was savage, wild, untamed, uncontrolled in his estimation. Englishmen arrived, tamed the wilderness, controlled the environment in a way Native American men were never able to do, and therefore put a proper level of civilization in place. But in every instance that he talks about this, he cannot define what it means to be an American without talking about it in opposition to what it meant to be native. Okay? So to be American was to be non-native. To be an American male was to be in control of the environment and the natural world. To be a Native American male was to have lost control. If you want to think about it another way, civilization, in Jefferson's estimation, allowed women to be liberated from the field and the public sphere and to find their proper place in the home. And Jefferson talks about it that way, saving women from labor, from laboring in the fields, from economic labor, putting them in their proper place in the home. If you were a poor family and you were unable to do this, in Jefferson's estimation, you're less American. You are, as a male in that relationship, you are emasculated in his image. You're not taking care of the proper role for women. And he believed fully only in America was this possible. Okay. Here you see a great image of the gleaners, women picking wheat in the field after the harvest. This image is from 1857. I wanted to let you know that in 1787, Thomas Jefferson took a tour of Europe. One of the places he visited was southern France. He wrote extensively about how horrified he was that French women were allowed to labor in the fields like common beasts, like animals, or, in some senses, like Native American or African women. So he believes that the French, that if you're going to talk about civilizing forces in the world, America is unique. If you allow the French peasantry to continue in this unnatural state, you're perpetuating a wrong, just like these Native American communities were perpetuating a wrong, just like African communities were perpetuating a wrong, because you don't have the proper gender relationships between men and women. And it's amazing to see how horrified he was that poor French women were still forced to work in the fields, which is horribly ironic because most of the people that lived in Virginia were very poor people. The vast majority of the whites that live in Virginia, very poor, and men and women had to labor in the fields. But that doesn't change his thinking about this. The true American, in his estimation, are these upper-class individuals who have completed total mastery and dominance over those around them, nature and the other people around them. You know, if you go back in biblical times, this image of Ruth gleaning in the fields, it was a wholesome image. You know, Ruth was someone to be admired. Somehow that's changed in Jefferson's estimation because of the crucible of North America, because of the relationships between Europeans and Native Americans. So here you see the quote from Jefferson's letters. He reacted harshly to women and children carrying heavy burdens and laboring with the hoe. For Jefferson, this was an unequivocal indication of extreme poverty. Men in a civilized country never expose their wives and children to labor above their force or sex as long as their own labor can protect them from it. So he has this image about the proper relationship between men and women, and he's very clear about this. Only in America does this exist. Okay? Europeans have lost their way or not evolved enough to keep up with what Americans are doing, especially in Virginia. I don't know what that tells you about the American Revolution, but if this is one of the guys in charge of it and he believes poor people are less than on all of these levels, can you imagine the kind of concern he might have for poor Americans as President of the United States or as somebody who drafts the Constitution, Declaration of Independence? That's a difficult question. This is a guy who has specific ideologies and images and concepts about race, gender, and class, who matters and who doesn't. Okay? All right, the last thing that I want to focus on, and I'll try to do this quickly so we can have some time for questions, is a specific abortion case. And I want to show you this before I actually get into it. If you go to this website at the University of Dayton, Richmond in Dayton, you can check out what I think, it's the only one I've ever encountered, the only full collection of one specific abortion case, in this instance in Pomfret, Connecticut in 1742. It outlines in a really organized fashion the chronology of the case, who the main players are, what's at stake, who's involved, just to show you a little bit of what this is like if you're interested in abortion in colonial America or in early America. There's huge amounts of material here. These are all the major players. I won't go through all of it, but I wanted you to be aware that there are resources out there that are easy for you to access if you're interested in these kinds of topics. These are the main players. There's a lot going on in this particular case. It's a pretty complex case. It's one that's fascinating. It's worth any amount of time that you spend on the website looking about it. But you have two young lovers, Amasa Sessions, the male, Sarah Grosvenor, the female. You have a doctor who's a main character, John Hollowell. Calling him a doctor is maybe a bit of a stretch. He is the guy, however, who performs the actual abortion. And then the father of Sarah, Leicester Grosvenor. Cornelia Hughes Dayton, the person who actually created this collection, this website, talks about this event as a reminder of the historically distinctive ways in which socialized gender roles, community and class, and legal culture combine in each set of generations to excuse or make invisible certain abuses and crimes against women. I see this case, however, a little bit differently. It's not just about crimes against women, it's about how all of these groups of people, men and women, learn gender roles. Okay, so by this point, by the time the case takes place, these people have all learned a particular way of life. Sarah becomes pregnant. She's horrified. She writes constantly to her friends that she feels huge shame and guilt. Not because she's pregnant out of wedlock, which she is, she's not married, but because she engaged in fornication outside of wedlock. It's the sex act that shames her, not the fact that she's with child. Abortion in colonial America, not illegal. Okay? That's a more modern concept, but difficult to achieve. Sarah is under immense pressure from Amasa to terminate the pregnancy. He makes no effort to convince her that he will care for her, he will marry her, or he'll care for her child. Okay? No, there's no indication whatsoever of that. It's never an expectation on his part that he should have a relationship with her beyond their original intercourse. So Sarah caves in. She writes about taking the trade. And there's no way to know exactly what this was, but that was code for taking some sort of medicinal or herbal concoction that would cause a miscarriage. It doesn't work. She starts to show. Her father is oblivious throughout this whole thing, if you can imagine. It's only at the end that he becomes aware of what's going on. Amasa, not Sarah, approaches John Hollowell to talk about an abortion. Forcible entry into the womb to remove the fetus. That's what he hopes to accomplish. Whether through puncture, there's no way to know exactly how they did that. But Hollowell agrees. They come up with a scheme. Hollowell visits the Grosvenors. He's a fairly well-respected member of the community at that time. He gets Sarah alone. He performs the abortion. Sarah is relieved at first, but then quickly becomes ill. She's having some complications, whether it's an infection or whatever it might be, and she dies. Okay, so the abortion was successful, but she dies. It's only when she dies that her family becomes irate. They want to know who caused her murder. And once they start looking into it, they uncover all of this subterfuge that's taking place. Sarah did not make this a secret, her pregnancy, to any of her friends. There are dozens of letters that survive to at least half a dozen other females in and around her community that she shared with them the fact that she had engaged in premarital sex and that she was pregnant and she was thinking about an abortion. It wasn't a secret, okay? At least among those female friends. They never told anybody. How they deal with it is different than how the men in Sarah's life deal with it. Interestingly, the only person who's ever put on trial for Sarah's death is John Hollowell, the doctor. Amasa is not put on trial. As a matter of fact, Leicester, when he figures out what has happened, wants no ill will toward Amasa. He encourages the courts in his local community to not take action against him. Keep it secret. As a matter of fact, if he could, he would like to have Hollowell put on trial without any mention of the abortion taking place, just saying that she was that Sarah had been ministered to by Hollowell and that he was her doctor, and in some sort of performance of his practitioner as doctor, he killed her. Okay, that was supposed to be the idea, but keep the pregnancy out of it. Leicester is much more interested in protecting the patriarchy that he's created. He is horrified, and he will write to others about his horror that he could not control the women in his life. Never considering that Amasa might be at fault here as well. Leicester considers the fault to be with Sarah, which is one of the interesting things. Hollowell is never convicted. He escapes from jail. He runs away. He petitions for a pardon. The pardon is eventually granted, and no one is ever convicted for the death of Sarah Grosvenor. But what you can see is women taking all of the guilt, all of the shame for premarital sex. So those ideas that we talked about before, that women as the weaker sex, that somehow Sarah's been leading this man astray, no blame is ever cast on Amasa. As a matter of fact, he goes on and marries and becomes a respectable member of the community with no repercussions whatsoever that he had participated in this event that led to her death. And she's basically sort of lost in the community record. So it's interesting that this has been resurrected and captured. And the actions of the father are probably the most interesting to me, right? His number one concern is how he will be viewed in the community if it's known that his daughter engaged in premarital sex. What's also curious from a modern perspective is Leicester doesn't care about the abortion. That's not the concern. Nobody is being prosecuted here for the abortion act. That's not the concern. The concern was premarital sex. That was the issue. And then, of course, Sarah's death. Those are the two crimes. Okay? So, learning gender roles embedded in society to the point where it causes people to behave in specific ways. All of this sort of an evolutionary process. What does this mean for us today? I have no idea. I just love these images. Okay, so I'm going to finish with these two images in opposition to each other and let you figure it out. Okay? All right. I'd be happy to take any questions.
First of all, that was very interesting. Thank you, Mike. I learned a lot. I have a question going back to the Native American women, though. I'm trying to figure out, like, obviously they were more on par with the men than the European women were, but that whole idea of them, you know, putting on the blood red paint and then lying down with the guests, to me still feels like they're being used by the male Native Americans, you know, like as a way to, I don't know what the purpose is to, with the guests that come. So were they on more equal par with the men in the Native American society?
Well, I think in terms of sexuality, they were. I mean, the hard thing to do is to not project our own concepts about sex and who controls sex. It's not like these Native American men controlled the sexuality of Native American women in the way we would think of it. You know, Pocahontas' father has many, many wives. And he refers to them, the only way the English have to translate it is temporary wives. He never marries formally one person for his whole life. He moves from wife to wife. And it's all about political alliances. The women are not abducted or forced or controlled in those relationships. They are willing participants forging bonds between this one major chieftain and their own tribe, their own tribal community. So I think that women are defining their own role in that diplomatic process in a way that was maybe sexual, but not that indicated that men are making them do this. Like, I don't know that there's any indication, and most historians would not say, that Pocahontas was forced to engage in this process of saving John Smith and going back with the English. She wasn't pressured against her own will. So I think there is more equality, although that's hard to measure. Any others? Yeah. If you guys can use the microphone, that would be helpful.
I was wondering what the driving force behind this gender control is. Like, what are the advantages versus the disadvantages, and how does that have like today's implication to that? You know, like, are we still trying to control the gender the same way as we were in the English colonies today?
What do you think the driving force behind it is?
I really don't know, because if it's something as base and animal as sex, that's ridiculous, and that shows a lack of enlightenment to the way these people are thinking. So beyond that, I can't think of anything that would stem and why it would.
Well, I think it's about economic control. I think the whole ability of men in these societies, these patrilineal, patriarchal societies, to control not only the household economy, but the business economy, the social world, the private world, including female sexuality. In a sense, female sexuality is being commoditized. It's being bought and sold and traded among men. It's part of a desire to control the community economically. That would be my view of it. But that's also a very sort of Marxist view.
Do you think the view that what to be American is to have the women in the home is more of a response of trying to separate themselves as far as possible from the Native Americans and African Americans and just try to say, we're nothing like them, this is how you be civilized and American?
Yes, and I think that's fantastic, because I don't know, it's hard to know if you're accomplishing what you hope to accomplish, but that's part of the message that I want you to understand, is that a system like that can only be created in opposition to the other. So there's never any preconceived notion that these Englishmen have when they arrive in North America about how gender should be structured. It changes through interactions with African slaves and through interaction with Native Americans, and becomes something different, something unique, and even in the minds of Jefferson, something uniquely American. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Did the Native Americans have any images attached to sex out of wedlock? Was it acceptable? Was it something to be looked down upon, but not as much?
Well, I'm not the expert on that necessarily. I mean, really was looking at this today through the eyes of Europeans, sort of projecting onto Native Americans rather than the other way around. And maybe Professor Hendershot can help me with that. But the idea, I think, is that there's much more sexual, well, I guess from a modern perspective, you would call freedom in Native American communities. There are less, gender relationships are much more fluid, and sexuality is not as rigidly controlled in Native American communities as it is in European communities. I think that's safe to say. Would you agree?
I would, yeah. And as regards to Anishinaabe, which I was talking about earlier today, in terms of a societal or a cultural ideal, people are supposed to wait until marriage. There isn't a harsh punishment for those who don't. But by the time someone is approaching adulthood, right, they're approaching sexual activity, and they're also approaching marriage, and the two things seem to go hand in hand with the Anishinaabe. And having said that, if pairings are supposed to, be two people, right? One husband, one wife in that relationship, and they're supposed to last forever. But if they don't, then they don't, right? Something as basic as incompatibility would be grounds enough for a divorce in many Native North American cultures. And so it's serial monogamy, right? You could be married to more than one person over the course of your life.
And every tribe's different. I mean, every Native American community is a little bit different. So that's one of the hard things about talking about Native American culture is it's easy to make generalizations, but once you get down to the nitty-gritty, each culture is different. Anything else? All right. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Light.